Welcome to Walk in the Shadows, Series 1, Episode 3 of Noisy Spirits, the Poltergeist Phenomenon, with me, your host, Tim Woolworth. With each case covered in Noisy Spirits, I try to present a new area of the Poltergeist Phenomenon, whether it is an observation or a new means of understanding these bizarre manifestations. There are hundreds of cases I could pull from, and I carefully chose the ones I've presented so far because of their nature. I have several more case files that I would like to present, but they would be redundant if I brought them into this Walk in the Shadows series. There are bonus episodes for our Patreon subscribers to listen to at their leisure. With all the topics we cover, the Walk in the Shadows bonus episodes expand upon the concepts in our episodes. Access to our bonus episodes and several other perks are available for less than the cost of a single book. This show requires a lot of resources to explore a topic, and I want to thank every Patreon supporter who helps make it easier for me to procure the necessary books and journal articles via donations. Without you, this show wouldn't be possible. Visit our Patreon, the link is in the show notes, to listen to our bonus episodes and to see what other benefits our patrons receive. So far in our Noisy Spirit series, I've introduced you to poltergeist case files that have hopefully helped to shape your understanding of this phenomenon, along with some theory about poltergeist eruptions. I won't review all the prior info here like I did in the introduction of Part 2 of our Noisy Spirit series, as there is just too much information to recap succinctly. I urge you to listen to Part 1 and Part 2 to prep you for this episode. I will once again present 2 more cases for you. In this episode, we enter the modern era of scientific inquiry. The first case is outstanding due to how the phenomenon manifested and how scientific measures were used to rule out every other possible cause for the eruption. And the second case is a case for the ages because scientific experimentation was introduced at the scene of the manifestation while it was occurring to better understand the phenomenon. Of all the places where you would expect a poltergeist manifestation to erupt, a lawyer's office is probably pretty low on that list. Yet during a short window, in 1967 to 1968, Sigmund Adams' law office was a place where a day at work was never boring. The law office in Rosenheim, Bavaria, was a small one. In addition to Herr Adams, there was a manager, Johannes Engelhardt, and 2 clerks, Gustl Huber and Anne-Marie Schneider, along with a part-time junior associate named Frau Bielmeier. In an age of pre-text messaging and emails, the telephone system was the lifeline of an office. At Sigmund Adams' law office, the telephone system was the first thing that signified something wasn't quite right. Adams' employees had problems dialing out because the lines were almost always busy. On the rare occasions where they were able to dial out, the connection cut in and out for no reason. After these events had been ongoing for about a month, a telecommunications bill was received, and the bill had soared over prior months. The employees noticed that the lines would show that there was a call going out, but when the line was picked up to monitor the call was silent. On other occasions, the phone would ring when no one was calling them. Finally, all the phones rang at once, something that was impossible because they were all on separate lines. A frustrated Herr Adams, not knowing what to do, called the local phone company that set up their office lines. The representative showed up at the office and examined the entire system, yet could find nothing mechanically wrong. After he left, the telephonic system continued to have problems, so a contractor from the phone company came out again and replaced all of the equipment. The system malfunctioned once more. Shifting blame, the telephone company said that the issue wasn't their equipment, so maybe the problem lay with the post office lines external to the building. Upon examination, the post office could not find any problems in their system either. You may be asking yourself why the post office was involved. I was curious as well, and I learned that Germany's state-run telephone system was initially arranged upon an infrastructure that used the postal service as the provider for phone lines right up until the 1990s. Ultimately, the telephonic equipment at the lawyer's office was replaced a second time, and the telephone lines themselves were also replaced by the post office. In addition to replacing everything, there was a meter attached to the lines to record all the calls coming in and going out of the office. Shortly thereafter, the meter showed a phone call being made from an office where no one was located at the time. The same thing occurred again, but this time there was a witness sitting with Adams who signed an affidavit for the phone company saying no one was on the phone at the time of the outgoing call. On October 5th, the post office then pulled records from the meter, and in the span of just 5 weeks, over 1,000 phone calls have been made, with the bulk of them coming from lines in only a couple of the offices. And the calls always occurred during business hours. The bulk of the telephone calls, over 600 of them, showed that they were constantly dialing out to a single number, 0119, Germany's speaking clock, more rapidly than a human could dial. Because the phones were pre-touch-tone in the 1960s, the mechanical nature of the phone meant that no one in the office could dial 0119 faster than 17 seconds. The phone calls leaving the office to dial the clock were going out every 15 seconds, which was faster than humanly possible at the time, and his staff adamantly denied making the calls. Herr Adams used this data to argue that he should not have to pay his exorbitant phone bill, but this fell upon deaf ears and the substantial telephone bill remittance was demanded in full. The post office reminded him that the calls were made from the office, they had been recorded on the meter, and therefore the law office was responsible for the billing. Herr Adams, being a practiced lawyer, knew he had the evidence to fight the phone bill. The post office disagreed, and ultimately canceled all the phone lines except the one in Adams' office, which was left with a keyed lock upon it. When locked, making an outgoing phone call was impossible. But yet, the phone calls continued to be made from the office. Soon thereafter, the telephone system was the least of Herr Adams' worries, as electrical mayhem erupted in the Adams Law Office. It started with darkness. On October 20th, all the lights in the office went out at the exact same time. After the telephone system issues, Herr Adams was no stranger to dealing with contractors in the office, so he promptly called an electrician. Upon cursory examination, the electrician found that every light bulb in the office had been unscrewed in its housing to the point where they were no longer making contact, and he screwed them back in to get them all working once more. When he was done, and packing up his tools to leave the job site, the light bulbs all unscrewed themselves yet again. He screwed the bulbs in once more, and then the electrician was able to go home after a very puzzling day. Shortly afterwards, the lights went dark again, as did every other power source in the office. It was found that every glass fuse blew at the same time. Herr Adams called the electricity supplier, and a senior engineer was sent to the office. Herr Brunner arrived on the 15th of November, and he reviewed the wires throughout the building and found nothing amiss. He replaced the fuses with a more modern version and installed meters to record electricity usage along with any fluctuations in voltage or changes in magnetic fields. 5 days later, Herr Brunner was called in again. He brought some fellow analysts because Herr Adams had reported that every light bulb had unscrewed once more, and the fluorescent overhead light tubes in Adams' office had somehow unscrewed themselves from their mountings, fell, and disintegrated upon the floor from impact. Brunner checked the meters he had installed, and found that there had been numerous power surges, with a large one occurring just before the fluorescent tube incident. The next day, Brunner returned to replace the fluorescent lights with standard light bulbs. While he was on site, the photocopier ink burst and spewed out of the machine. The following day, every light bulb blew. Brunner wanted to solve this mystery, so he connected the office to a local substation, and the power surges still continued. Trying to isolate the incident, Brunner took the office off the main power supply and connected it to its own independent generator while the substation was examined by Brunner. He found that the substation was functioning perfectly. While on the generator, the light bulbs continued to explode. It was becoming obvious that the problem was not part of the telephone or the electrical system. This was made abundantly clear in late November. The light fixtures in the hall began to sway in a controlled fashion from side to side. To Adam's amazement, a painting hung by a cord that rested upon a nail began to rotate. After its rotation, the cord on the back was found to be wrapped around the nail itself. Herr Brunner gave up. He stated that, It is necessary to postulate the existence of a power as yet unknown to science, of which neither the nature, nor strength, nor direction could be defined. It is an energy beyond comprehension. The electricity company reached out to scientists at the Max Planck Institute. Two physicists, Friedbart Karger and Gerhard Zika, were sent to Adams' law office to investigate the cause of the telephonic and electrical disturbances. The physicists then continued with multiple experiments to rule out other causal factors like magnetic fields, infrasonics, ultrasonics, electrostatics, any strong vibrations, and of course, any possible fraudulent manual mechanisms creating the effects. The events were still occurring and being monitored. To rule out an electrical disturbance, the physicists decided to disconnect the electrical service monitoring device from the power source in the office. They hooked the monitoring device up to a 1.5-volt battery as its power source. The battery continually gained voltage as it reached 3 volts, and the needle of the monitoring device jumped as the power issues continued. This should not have been possible. Again, they could not assign any of these sources as being the genesis of the poltergeist eruption, and remarked on how the anomalies seemed to be under intelligent control. At this point, Adams felt that someone was trying to actively sabotage his business, and doing what he knew best, he called in local law enforcement and an officer Wendell took over the case. Wendell knew that the physical aspects of the case had been thoroughly examined by minds trained for such things, so he decided to immediately turn his attention to the people in the office and any motivation that they may have for undertaking a campaign of malice. Upon examination, Officer Wendell turned his attention to the 19-year-old Anne-Marie Schneider. She seemingly had a grudge against Herr Adams and often blamed him for the state of the office relations which were strained between employees and management. Looking further into the situation, he found that the events only happened on the days where she was present in the office. In a page out of Cesare Lombroso's work, Wendell asked Herr Adams to give each employee a couple days off. When it was Anne-Marie's time to take a couple days off, the office functioned normally, with no adverse events. Approaching the situation as a trained police officer would, he put Anne-Marie under observation. Despite being under acute surveillance, the events continued. The final straw was when Anne-Marie and a fellow employee were in an office, and a massive wooden cabinet moved to the center of the room. The cabinet was over 400 pounds, and it was impossible for any one person in the office to move it. It took 2 policemen who struggled mightily to put the cabinet back into place. With no one left to turn to, Adams reached out to a local professor who was known for his investigations into weird situations just like this. Dr. Hans Bender, a famed psychical researcher who was a professor at the Institute of the Study of Border Areas of Psychology at the University of Freiburg, traveled to the office to study the case as it was happening. Bender was one of the most well-known investigators of poltergeist phenomena in the world, and most certainly was the most experienced in Germany at the time of the eruption. With minimal observation, he noted that the events seemed to follow an employee, Anne-Marie Schneider. In fact, Bender immediately noticed that the events only occurred when she was there, and the eruptions did not start until she entered the office to work in the morning. Then the events climaxed. The lights hanging in the hallway would drop down from the ceiling and merely hang by their wires. Light bulbs would explode as Anne-Marie walked by, covering her in glass by the time she reached the end of the hall. Bender determined that Anne-Marie was unsatisfied with her job, specifically her boss. This was compounded with other emotional upheaval, as she had just gone through a difficult breakup of her marriage engagement. Bender posited that she was unwittingly emitting an uncontrolled electrical energy that affected her surroundings, as a means of unconsciously working off the grudge she held against her boss. The events of the eruption continued unabated. The 400-pound cabinet moved again. The painting rotated 320 degrees on the wall and was filmed by Bender. There were loud thumps and bangs. Bender was convinced that the eruption was getting through to the relays on the phone, likely through bursts of psychokinesis, and subsequently bypassing the manual functions. Bender convinced Anne-Marie to join him at his lab in Freiburg for a few days for experimentation. Bender found that she had minimal psychokinetic abilities when tested, but to his surprise, she had exceptional ESP abilities in a laboratory environment. While she was away, the poltergeist eruption stopped. During her leave, Herr Adams dismissed Anne-Marie, and she found new employment. At her new location, there were some anomalous events, but they were far less obvious and stopped in very short order. There were no further incidents at the Adams Law Office once Anne-Marie was fired. During this case, there were many expert witnesses, including technicians from the telephone company and post office, the power company, police investigators, journalists, Sigmund Adams, other employees, physicists, and Hans Bender. Dr. Bender personally investigated more than 35 poltergeist cases and remarked that the Rosenheim case was the most impressive because of the way the eruption manifested itself. At first, the telephonic system was the sole form of manifestation. As the phone issues were being ruled out by experts, the manifestation morphed into an electrical one. It is as if the manifestation changed upon recognition, as if the phenomenon was sensitive to the attitudes and beliefs of the witnesses. In this case, the phenomenon did not take on the guise of a traditional manifestation until Dr. Bender arrived with the suspicion that this was a poltergeist case. It was after he spoke of it being a possible poltergeist that the movement of objects, banging, pictures rotating, etc. began in earnest. Today, Rosenheim has become a touchstone case that illustrates how trained scientists, technicians, and engineers use their expertise to rule out any physical causes for the event, leaving only the inexplicable, the paranormal, as a result. The next case we'll cover is another landmark study of the poltergeist phenomenon, because like the Bender case in Rosenheim, a parapsychologist was able to arrive on the scene in the midst of the eruption and apply scientific methods to the manifestation. This case happened in Miami, just a few months before the Rosenheim event in 1967. The Miami Poltergeist is a famous case investigated by parapsychologists William Roll with assistance by Gaither Pratt. This well-documented case began on January 14, 1967, at Tropication Arts, a wholesale business in Florida primarily selling novelty items like hand-painted glassware, steins, and ashtrays that tourists love to buy as a reminder of their trip. A phone call was made by a part owner of the business, Alvin Lobheim, to the police with a strange complaint. He pre-qualified the call by stating that the police will either think him a nut or a drunk, but there was a ghost in the business who was going around breaking ashtrays. The ashtrays were flying up off the shelves and smashing to the ground. When the patrolman arrived about 10 minutes later, he found Alvin and his shipping clerk, a 19-year-old Cuban refugee named Julio Vasquez. They promptly led the officer into the warehouse. The warehouse was a large room with aisles that were floor to ceiling and filled with merchandise. The patrolman, William Killen, walked the warehouse looking for anything odd. When he returned after his tour to talk to Alvin and Julio, he looked a bit sheepish when he stated that he saw a highball glass fall to the floor and break. He also noted that he heard other things breaking and saw the remnants, but had not actually seen the items themselves fall to the floor. Officer Killen knew he couldn't just write up a report on this, so he called his sergeant saying,
"I'm telling you, Sarge, you better get down here and see this for yourself. If I hand you the report on this without you being here and seeing it, you'll have me up in an institute or something."
Officer Killen turned to Alvin and said, "The Sarge is coming over, but he's not happy. He thinks I've gone nuts." Shortly thereafter, Killen's sergeant, William McLaughlin, and 2 other patrolmen arrived at Tropication Arts at about noon. By the time they had arrived, there had been 4 more incidents. Boxes were being toppled to the floor, and other items were witnessed being disturbed as well. In addition to the officers, another person arrived on the scene. This individual was a professional magician by the name of Howard Brooks, an old friend of Alvin's, who happened to be in town working on an ice show. He was called in to see if he could ascertain if there was any trickery going on. Brooks found nothing to support trickery. As the group was gathered to discuss what had been witnessed at the front of the warehouse, a stack of heavy address books, about 7 inches away from the edge of the shelf, was pushed to the floor in the view of everyone. Immediately it was investigated, and the shelf was very stable, even after being subjected to a shaking test. It was at this time Alvin revealed to all the police present that the events had been happening for about a month. He spoke of an incident where he was annoyed at how much inventory was getting damaged. Being that he only had 2 warehouse employees, Alvin placed the blame on the carelessness of Julio and the other shipping clerk, Kurt. Alvin was specifically drawn to the warehouse by the noise made by a box of 100 back scratchers falling to the floor with a great clatter and scattering upon impact. He was fed up with the incompetence of his employees and grabbed a box of glass beer mugs with wooden handles and showed the two clerks how to properly lay the mugs on their sides with the handles facing out so the weight was on the shelf. Alvin specifically pushed the box against the wall, some 8 inches from the shelf as an appropriate demonstration. He had even stated, "If you put them in this position, they will not break or fall off the shelf." Alvin then turned to walk back to his desk, and to everyone's amazement, the box he had just placed on the shelf had fallen to the floor. They had spent the following days picking up things as fast as they could fall. Word got around. Delivery men started witnessing the events. Alvin's secretary was frightened and cried at the sight of things breaking on their own. It was then that he decided to call the police, and the police duly filed their report, with no suspect to arrest. An insurance agent, William Drucker, was sent to the site to investigate the claims of so many broken items. He investigated the shelves to see how the items were stored on them for a full 75 minutes. When he turned to leave, he heard a giant thud. He turned around to investigate and noticed 2 unopened boxes, still tied together, had fallen to the floor. They had inexplicably fallen from a shelf he had examined just moments beforehand. It was shortly after this that William Roll was called in to investigate due to the recommendation of a friend, fellow paranormal investigator and author, Susie Smith. Susie had been on a Florida radio show promoting her latest book. The show had an open line segment where anyone could call in and ask questions. It was during this segment that one of the 3 artists, whose job it was to hand-paint the highballs with images at Tropication Arts, called in and spoke about what was going on in the warehouse. Susie called William Roll, a parapsychologist who had more experience investigating poltergeist-type events than anyone else in the United States, and invited him to Florida. Dr. William Roll should be a name that you are familiar with. We covered his theory of recurring spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK, as being the genesis of a poltergeist eruption in a prior episode. Dr. Roll was not able to arrive until January 19th due to prior engagements. Susie agreed to monitor the building in Roll's stead for a few days to document any occurrences and their location in the building. Susie had invited a fellow investigator, Sinclair Bunton, who happened to be in town, to examine Tropication Arts on January 17th, 3 days after the police had left. Sinclair was a pilot for a regional airline. He traveled the warehouse with Julio, who showed him the locations where there were incidents of objects falling off shelves. During the tour, several items proceeded to fall on their own. Sinclair noticed one item fall at almost a 30-degree angle off the shelf. This meant that it had to be lifted and pushed to slide off at that angle. After spending a couple hours in the warehouse watching things fall, Alvin arrived with a newspaper reporter in tow. Alvin specifically showed both Sinclair and the reporter where the beer mugs had fallen after he had set them properly on the shelf. About 5 minutes later, there was a smash. And as I'm sure you've probably already guessed, it was a beer mug. The location of the destroyed mug was curious, as it was shattered on the floor almost a full aisle over from where it was placed on the shelf. Sinclair and Alvin secured a mug with the wooden handle wedged tightly between 2 boxes, and a few minutes later, that same exact mug was destroyed on the floor. Roll was able to arrive at the warehouse on January 19th. He noticed immediately that the phenomenon seemed to diminish in his presence. He felt that if it were trickery, the police who had been investigating the events along with the magician would have easily ferreted out any manual manipulation. In fact, a couple days earlier, the magician Brooks had thought it was manual manipulation, and demonstrated how easily it could be accomplished by misdirection and throwing an object. Then he changed his mind when he watched 2 cartons fall to the floor unassisted. He told Roll of what he had witnessed. "I can't buy this spook theory at this point, but something did move those, and I couldn't figure it out." By this point, groups of reporters were arriving on the scene and filming the warehouse. Officers would stop by with friends and relatives. Tropication Arts had become a paranormal playground of sorts, and nearly everyone who was on the scene, including the media, was able to bear witness to or hear items being cast to the floor. On one occasion, 2 separate boxes, placed at different points on the same shelf, wound up on the floor, mysteriously stacked on top of each other. On January 20th, the day after Roll arrived, there were a total of 52 incidents of items falling and being smashed in a single day. This constituted nearly a quarter of the events, 224 in total, observed since the 14th at the warehouse. Roll and others began to set up decoy objects to try to get the phenomenon to react as it had with the multiple beer mug incidents. The use of decoy objects allowed for some semi-scientific controls to be exerted upon the location by trying specifically to get these chosen objects to be disturbed. Objects like Coca-Cola bottles were placed conspicuously on the shelves. Almost every decoy object was then smashed to the floor by the unseen entity. One decoy object was a beer mug, wiped clean of fingerprints, and placed on a shelf in a roped-off area. The warehouse was evacuated, and everyone went to lunch except Roll and Julio. Over the course of an hour, a shot glass and a beer mug had been thrown to the floor, but the decoy mug remained. They continued to wait and observe. Then it happened. The decoy mug was smashed when no one was looking. The target object, the people present, and the area of the warehouse were all controlled. Unfortunately, the police were too busy dealing with other Miami crimes and had no interest in examining the pieces of beer mug for fingerprints, which would have ruled out any physical manipulation. A television reporter was there to record the events. During their stay, a decoy Pepsi bottle had been taken off a shelf and thrown a full 36 feet across the room. The events seemed to happen in front of everyone, but they decreased whenever Roll was around. If he moved out of the warehouse to the shipping area, there would be more activity in the warehouse. Because of this, Roll tried another approach. He decided to exit the warehouse and leave the magician Brooks in his stead for observation purposes. It was only 10 minutes after Roll had left that Brooks observed a mug crashing to the floor. He immediately raced over, and there were no wires, string, nor anything else in the magician's toolkit that could account for the object being propelled off of the shelf. The next day was Saturday the 21st, and Tropication Arts closed on the weekend. Roll had asked to have an employee present who could let him in for the investigation. That Saturday was the last day he would be available for several days. Roll had an important meeting of the board of directors at the Psychical Research Foundation on Monday the 23rd in North Carolina. Roll was granted access to the building that Saturday. Also present were Susie, Julio, and Alvin. Roll had taken notice that when something crashed to the floor, everyone present would rush to the location where the item fell. This made it difficult to ascertain where people were standing at the time of the incident. Roll requested that when something fell, it was imperative that everyone needed to freeze in their position instantly. Then a box fell. With everyone frozen in position, Roll was able to determine that no one was in the vicinity of the box, and therefore the case certainly had merit for further investigation after his trip to North Carolina. At his meeting, he was able to get the president of the board of the Psychical Research Foundation, Dr. Gaither Pratt, to attend the investigation with him. Having left on the 21st, Roll returned to Miami on the 25th. The game plan for the investigation was to continue to use decoy objects. Roll wanted to move into experimentation without disrupting the cycle of events as they had been happening for almost a month and a half at this point. Decoys had been used successfully by several people prior to Roll's return, and he felt that the continuation of this method would garner the best results. His experience had informed him that during a poltergeist investigation, focusing upon certain objects and eruption characteristics were the best way to achieve positive results. In this case, the target objects and the area in which they are placed could be under strict controls. They could be examined for stage magic machinations, physical anomalies, the use of chemicals, etc. It is much easier to explore a small, controlled area than it is an entire location. Because this was a working business, Roll could not rope off areas. Instead, he simply observed an area he had prepped for investigation. Every time an employee went in the vicinity of that area of the warehouse, Roll immediately examined the area for any changes. With this framework, if a decoy object moved, then Roll would know if it was the experimentation object since he had placed it there. This made it easy to know how far the object moved and any other details that may not have been observed prior. Julio was out of work the first day of the investigation with a cold. Nothing occurred in the warehouse. When Julio came back the next day, he got into an argument with another worker and an alligator ashtray, a decoy object intentionally set behind another item on the shelf, a bell, lay broken on the floor. For the ashtray to be destroyed, the item had to be lifted over or moved around the bell and then fall to the floor to overcome the obstacles and not ring the bell in the process. Roll immediately investigated the area, as it had been under observation, and found no signs of physical manipulation. Julio was interviewed about 20 minutes after the event, and he said that he felt happy that the ashtray broke, but he did not know why. Dr. Gaither Pratt arrived on the 27th, and William Roll introduced him to Julio as merely a friend interested in the phenomenon and not as a parapsychologist. Shortly after Gaither's arrival, an object fell off the shelf and broke. Roll asked Julio to put another object in its place. Both Roll and Pratt examined the object and shelf periodically. Roll once again felt that the event slowed when he was present and left the building, leaving Gaither to observe for him. Not even 5 minutes after he left, the object was smashed to the floor, and Gaither immediately examined it after the employees had frozen in place. Everyone was accounted for, and Julio was 2 aisles away with both hands full. Gaither had been tape recording his observations at the exact moment the object fell to ensure investigative posterity. They proceeded to conduct another Saturday investigation to limit the number of people present. Gaither was there instead of Roll to help promote activity. While he was interviewing Julio, a large 2-quart jar smashed to the floor. When they located the jar, Julio was asked where it was located, and he pointed to a table on the other side of the room where indeed there was a perfect dust ring in the shape of a circle. The jar had flown a remarkable 22 feet. Gaither left on January 30th, and Roll stayed on for a couple more days. During that time, 28 incidences occurred, but only 13 happened in the presence of Roll. It seemed that his presence no longer inhibited the phenomenon from occurring. For one event, Roll wanted to see if the items were being lifted. To test this, he placed some notebooks in front of the decoy object, and when the item was smashed, the notebooks were fully undisturbed, meaning that the object had to be lifted and horizontally moved before crashing to the floor. Another event involved a beer mug being placed behind 2 small cartons, in between a cowbell and a Fanta bottle. The mug was smashed to the floor. When the event happened, everyone froze in place as instructed, and Roll measured that the mug hit the floor about 4 feet away from Julio, with the direction of movement being away from him. Considering the mug had to be lifted, moved forward, and then thrown, and neither the Fanta bottle nor the cowbell were disrupted, Roll had no physical explanation as to how these events could have happened. Roll eventually left, and the activity still carried on. The case remains remarkable because it was the first time that experimental controls were imposed upon a supposedly uncontrollable phenomenon. Both Gaither and Roll felt that psychokinesis was the genesis of the poltergeist eruptions. They also surmised that the psychokinesis must be generated from the one person who had been present for the events in the warehouse, Julio. This once again demonstrated that the poltergeist phenomenon was person-centered, not place-centered. Julio was outwardly passive and calm, which was an illusion he maintained to not reflect what he was feeling inside. Roll and Pratt, both psychologists, brought Julio to Durham, North Carolina, to undergo psychoanalysis at Duke University Parapsychology Laboratory. During psychoanalysis, it was revealed that Julio's home life had been upended a few days before the poltergeist activity began. He was of Cuban descent and was rejected by his mother as a child. It was also revealed that he had dissociative tendencies, especially in relation to expressing aggression. Days before the events began at the warehouse, his stepmother forced him to move out of his father's house at age 19. He had lived with his father since childhood. His home life was in chaos, and it was apparently being reflected in the manifestation of psychokinesis at his workplace. The manifestation resulted in hundreds of items being damaged. Of the 224 cases that manifested at the Tropicana Arts warehouse, Julio was present for all of them except one outlying incident that may have been the result of improper stacking of the object on the shelf. After analyzing the objects that were affected and their position relative to Julio, Roll surmised that there must be some mechanical force at play. Glassware that extended past a certain distance from Julio was unaffected. The objects closest to Julio tended towards short, outward, and clockwise movements to his right side. This was mirrored by objects further away that made longer, anti-clockwise movements at right angles to his position and to the left. After mapping all the experiments on affected items versus Julio's location, Roll felt that there was a cigar-shaped rotating beam of unknown psychokinetic force emanating from Julio's head. He could not quantify the force, nor link it to any known force or structure in the human body. For now, it is just a working theory, as is most everything in the paranormal field. Thank you for your time spent walking in the shadows with me. I know your time is valuable, so I really appreciate you being here, in this moment. This episode was researched, written, and produced by me, Tim Woolworth. The audio wizardry is courtesy of our engineer and fellow explorer of the unknown, Joshua Shawn at 0G ITC. Hopefully this episode made a little bit of our paranormal world more normal for you. As always, if you have any personal anecdotes, observations, or alternate explanations you would like to share on this or any other topic we've covered, or just maybe you would like to drop a note to say hi, you can always reach us via our email, contact@walkintheshadows.com. Once again, that's contact, spelled CONTACT, @walkintheshadows.com. If you think what Walk in the Shadows offers is a valuable service for sating your paranormal curiosity, hit subscribe and review this podcast. And please, tell a friend. It really does help. If you want to learn more about this podcast or myself, please visit our Walk in the Shadows website. The link is in the show notes. On our website, you can find all of our social media accounts, our mailing list, and our Patreon should you decide to support us. Your support not only gives you benefits like ad-free content, bonus episodes, access to our Discord server, exclusive free merchandise, Ask Me Anything sessions, and much more. It also helps us keep high-quality paranormal content delivered regularly to the podcast player of your choice. Until next episode, may you and yours be healthy, prosperous, and treated with kindness by everyone you meet both in the light and in the shadows.